So I'd like to answer a question that I have received quite a bit in varying ways over the years. And that question is at the root of it about the correlation between trauma and psychic abilities. Basically, does trauma create psychic abilities? Is there a correlation between them? How does trauma create psychic abilities and sensitivities? So to start to answer that question, I'm going to talk about my definition of psychic or a highly sensitive person. What you will notice about my definition is that it kind of grounds it in simplicity. It takes it away from being this kind of high, abstract, mystical concept into something that anyone can sort of grasp. So imagine that 5 people walk into a room. The first notices 10 things about that room, the second 40, the third 150, the fourth 500, and the fifth 5,000. And so all of these are little bits of information that are coming through to the person that they are picking up in their own way. Person one may just notice, oh, there's a poster in this room, look at that rug, and those sorts of things. And then when we go along the spectrum, it becomes more about things like perhaps noticing the mood of the people in the room, noticing other information about them, such as their energy, or being able to see or sense their energy body, being able to sense something about the land or the room that they're in or the general atmosphere, maybe something that happened there last night. I could go more and more into this, but I'd like to keep it simple and say that person one or two would be considered, for all intents and purposes, normal, having the normal range of human sensitivities or capacities. Person 3 to 5 would then be considered, to some degree, highly sensitive to highly psychic. In my book, Managing Psychic Abilities, I create a whole spectrum of this and talk about what somebody who is mildly psychic versus somebody who is highly psychic might experience. And that has everything to do with how much information they are picking up from their environment. And I will say that picking up that much from your environment when you are getting towards that 500 or 5,000 sort of marker, all those bits of information coming at you, are a lot for the nervous system, for your mind, body, and spirit to try to absorb, to try to process and make sense of. And so let me share a bit about my background as well, because that might be helpful. I've always been an incredibly sensitive person, except when I was younger, I didn't have the conscious awareness to be able to describe it in those terms. I just knew that I was sensing reality differently than the people around me in some regards. And so when I grew up and I started seeking, I started searching, what I found was a lot of information about how to develop psychic abilities, how to develop sensitivities, and not much about what to do if you are so sensitive that it can create difficulties for you in your life. And so what started happening with me as I started working with and developing tools for my own sensitivities and doing research is that when I started my clinical practice, I would have more and more people come to me who would be defined as anywhere between highly sensitive to mildly, moderately, or even highly psychic. And so over the years, over the decades, I have worked with people and found out not only what works for me, but what works for other people, and, kind of creating a basic map or basic hypothesis about some of this stuff, including this question. So let's go back to this question. What I found when I was doing research, basically when I was working with this population over a period of time, is that people who tended to the moderately to highly psychic category of individuals, meaning that they were quite psychic, they were quite sensitive, they were the people walking into the room and noticing 500 or 5,000 things, is that all of them had childhood trauma. Without exception, every single person that I have met who is highly psychic or even moderately psychic would fit into this category. And so one of the thoughts or understandings that I now have is that when we are children, when we are in a home that feels not safe, what happens is that we open our senses because of trauma, because of abuse, because of neglect, because of whatever is going on there. We had a need to be more sensitive than the kind of average person in order to keep ourselves safe. And so if you think this through, it makes a lot of sense. That person that has really open hearing can hear very ordinary things, just very sensitive to hearing overall, sensitive to music, but also becomes sensitive in a clairaudient capacity. They may have started out listening for their mother's footsteps coming down the hall because they knew that those would be angry footsteps. And so they biologically, energetically reattuned their system in order to survive, basically to hear those footsteps as soon as commonly possible. Same thing can happen with moods. People who tend to describe themselves as empaths or people who tend to take on a lot of emotional stuff from people. They may have been in a household in which their parents couldn't regulate their moods. And so what they attempted to do with their own system was to be peacekeeper and to also take on those energies from their parents in the hope that if they did so, their parents would be calmer, their parents would be more present for them. They may actually be able to parent them and caretake them for them better if they basically turn into a sponge and absorb all their parents' stuff or caretake for them. And so I realize that this is a very unromantic way of looking at sensitivities and psychic abilities, but it is helpful to understand that a lot of people who are in the moderate to highly sensitive or psychic capacity became more aware of their surroundings because of a basic survival mechanism. They opened up their systems, they became more sensitive because it would allow for them to survive the situation that they are in. Now, let's make things a bit more complicated here. Although I cannot, prove such things, there has been quite a bit of research or understanding that specific lineages, specific cultures tend to have people that have, for example, specific psychic abilities or that tend to be more psychic or sensitive than others. For example, the old kind of cliche of the Italian grandmother who can give the evil eye. So my understanding there with working with people who, working with ancestral healing with people for a long period of time, and just kind of sitting with the research and diaries and all that stuff that has come through from seers and sensitives and psychics of all types, is that the hypothesis would be about ancestral trauma as well, is that ancestors also, just like some of us may have in our early childhood, developed their own psychic capacities, their own psychic abilities because of trauma, stress, struggle that they were experiencing. And so what happens is that then can pass down the lineage and become something that is both of benefit and also something that maybe need to be healed. For example, if you are Irish and have the tendency towards second sight, basically that you're able to see things happening in the future, happening at a distance, or to dream true, those sorts of capacities, those may be very helpful. They may also be disturbing to sleep, and you may not know what to do with them, and that sort of stuff too, which happens to people. But there can be a thought that of healing any trauma that may have created that may have caused for that to happen, and retaining the gifts and learning how to work with them and learning how to train them. So let's talk about things in a slightly different regard. There are considered several portals to awakening. That's a fancy way for, gateways or reasons why we may become more conscious of the world around us. A big one is trauma. This may be something that has happened to us, such as, abuse or, difficulties when we were a child, when we were going through childhood development and sort of creating our wiring. This may be in a relationship later in life, something like that. But we can also consider the trauma and difficulties that all of us as humans go through. Births, deaths, sicknesses, moving, divorce, marriage. All of those things are big changes in our lives, big changes in our being, getting fired, getting hired, all of that sort of stuff. And they can be the type of trauma that creates essentially a portal to awakening. It causes for us, for a moment, to have an expanded perspective. For example, say that a loved one dies, and the day before you were focused on, writing angry comments in the news or, somewhere on TikTok or, something like that. You were wrapped up in something there. And then all of a sudden, a parent or a sibling or something dies, and you recognize that what you were doing yesterday was kind of stupid and it was kind of narrow, and you start thinking about wider things. You start thinking about your own life and death. You start thinking about what happens when we die and kind of more existential things. And so birth, death, trauma, sex, those are all considered portals to awakening. What you will notice if you look at ritual work, magical work, if you look at other work that, meditation retreats, plant spirit medicine retreats, bodywork retreats, what they are all doing to a certain degree is introducing elements of deprivation and essentially elements of trauma in order to create an environment of awakening. And so this may be creating a specific diet for people at those retreats or experiences. It may be sleep deprivation. It may be forcing people to be together for long periods of time or forcing people to be apart for long periods of time. And the objective of those things, even when, when they are done for specific positive purposes, are creating a specific trauma in the system in order to create awakening, in order to create opening of the system, in order to create essentially an increase in perspective, increase in awakening, and in some ways, will create heightened sensitivity in the system through participating in those things. I will say that I was a ritual magician for a long period of time. And some of the, kind of highest rituals that everybody talks about, that are considered, kind of the creme de la creme of rituals and that sort of stuff. If you really look at them and if you really work at them, work with them and break them down, they are actually incredibly boring for 99% of them or 9/10 of them. What some of them require is a period of days of specific diet, specific prayer, specific, ways of going about your daily life. But this repetition and the deprivation and the doing of these mundane things creates a state of preparation and opening of the system for kind of the last 1/10 of things to be effective. And it's also a great trial because, some people will want to skip or shorten the first 9/10 in order to get to what supposedly is the good stuff without realizing that there's all those prayers, all of that preparation is there for a reason. So the reason that I'm mentioning this, other than the fact that it may interest some of you, is that when we are looking at spiritual work, meditation, ritual work, such as in magic or shamanic work. These also, or if we're talking about meditation retreats, ayahuasca retreats, bodywork retreats, I certainly went to plenty of retreats for bodywork like craniosacral, zero balancing, this sort of stuff, that were quite intensive and introduced some of these trauma elements, little sleep, little food, specific types of food coming together in a state of intensity, in a state like a field of excitement, that sort of stuff. And those created states of awakening in people. In some cases, those fields weren't maintained properly. And so people would have breakdowns and that sort of stuff that also happens in individual work like meditation, occultism, that shamanic work and stuff like that, all of the time, because the system isn't stabilized enough to be able to handle the type of awakening, the type of emergence that is trying to come through. So let's kind of wrap it up and bring it back to the original question. Does trauma cause psychic abilities and sensitivities? Yes. We can, in varying ways, have our systems be open, our perspective be shifted, how we perceive reality to considerably shift in trauma, especially at an early childhood age when we're sort of developing our wiring, certainly makes us need to see or sense more of reality than a lot of people might need to. Same thing goes for ancestral trauma as well. Our ancestors needed to survive some pretty horrific conditions, and some lineages survived through working with their gods, working with the divine, working with their spiritual connections and developing spiritual and psychic sensitivities in order to be able to simply survive some of the situations that they were in. And those capacities tend to be the strongest that are passed down. And so people who tend to be very highly psychic will tend to have both ancestral trauma as well as personal trauma. Um, and so the other question that might come in is, if we heal ourselves, will we become less sensitive? The response to that is no. Sometimes I get people who come to me and ask if they can, shut down their psychic abilities or sensitivities. I certainly was like that for a large portion of my life. And on rare occasion, I would say I'm occasionally like that now, sometimes, being too aware isn't exactly the cuddliest thing on earth some days. But there is a way to heal from whatever trauma is there, whatever personal trauma, whatever ancestral trauma is present. And there are ways to develop skills. And those skills can make all of the difference in the world. So a lot of those skills, beginning, intermediate skills, I offer in my Managing Psychic Abilities book. And for those of you looking for intermediate or advanced skills, I also suggest my shamanic curriculum. So my shamanic workbooks 1, 2, and 3. Those are really the best ways to learn how to work with your sensitivities and psychic capacities. I will say, outside of my books, even though I'm always willing to throw my my books out there, because of course I'm chatting, is that I find that occult and mystical curriculums, if you are open to them, if you're beyond kind of the mythic, aspects of reality telling us that that stuff is horrible and all that sort of stuff, is that I started with Franz Barden's book. So Initiation into Hermetics. It is still out there. It can help for one of the things that it really helped me with was that, or started to help me with, was that my mind tends to go from A to Z. That is the way that a lot of people's intuitive, sensitive, psychic minds tend to do, without sort of filling in the rest of the alphabet. And so I meet a lot of people whose minds tend to go from A to G, A to Q, A to Z, and backing up and finding a curriculum like that, or finding the discernment work in my shamanic workbooks, particularly the first one in my Managing Psychic Ability book, is really necessary to sort of fill in the rest of that alphabet and become more comfortable and confident with your psychic abilities.